No other European composer had a more profound effect on English music than that of Jean-Baptiste Lully. The English Civil War, followed by Oliver Cromwell's Protectorate, saw English music brought to the very brink of annihilation. Firmly ensconced in his position of absolute power and influence in Paris, and having never once set foot on English soil, he directed the course of English musical development in the years immediately following the restoration of Charles II to the throne. In 1626, and on his 26th birthday, the second-born son of King James ascended to the throne as England's Charles I. Following the tragic and untimely death of his elder brother Henry, Charles was neither intended nor prepared to assume the reins of government. Believing, however, in his own divine right to govern, Charles attempted to establish an absolutist government. He soon found himself in a struggle for power with Parliament, in particular, levying taxes without parliamentary consent. His actions were seen as those of a tyrannical monarch. What's more, his marriage to a Catholic princess and his alliances with controversial ecclesiastical figures brought the Church of England too close to the Catholic Church. Charles finally dissolved Parliament and ruled absolutely for 11 years, after which time he was forced to recall Parliament in order to approve funds to raise an army to suppress a Scottish uprising. Upon its being reconvened, of the 493 members of Commons, Charles had the support of only 94. Parliament became deeply divided between supporters of the Crown, who became known as the Cavaliers, and those who opposed it, the Roundheads. Parliament was less interested in the Scottish uprising and more interested in finally airing their grievances against Charles' style of rule. Charles and his few royalist supporters were outnumbered and at an impasse with the parliamentarians, who demanded that Charles amend his method of rule. Charles refused, citing his divine right, and plunged England into civil war. During this time, the royal family escaped to France. Royalist forces eventually lost, proving no match for the superior trained and well-supplied parliamentary army led by parliamentarian Oliver Cromwell. Charles was eventually captured and put on trial, held responsible for the unjustifiable bloodshed of the Civil War. Charles remained defiant to the last and refused to enter a plea, claiming no court had jurisdiction over a monarch. His own authority to rule had been given to him by God. It was then normal practice to take a refusal to plead as pro confesso, an admission of guilt. The king was declared guilty and beheaded in 1649. With the death of Charles at the climax of the Civil War, England entered a period known as the English Interregnum, or the English Commonwealth, and the country became a de facto republic, led by Oliver Cromwell, a parliamentarian and a Puritan. After the parliamentarian victory in the Civil War, the Puritan views of the majority of Parliament and its supporters began to be imposed on the rest of the country. The Puritans advocated an austere lifestyle and restricted what they saw as the excesses of the previous regime. Most prominently, holidays such as Christmas and Easter were suppressed. Pastimes such as the theatre and gambling were also banned. After the Civil War, England was ruled directly by Parliament, having declared itself a Commonwealth in 1649. Prompted by the perceived ineffectiveness of its rule and its refusal to dissolve itself, this rump Parliament was forcibly dissolved in April of 1653 by soldiers led by Cromwell. After the dissolution of the Parliament, a new constitution, known as the Instrument of Government, was put forward. It declared Cromwell Lord Protector for life, charged with undertaking the chief magistracy and the administration of government. He had the power to call and dissolve parliaments. Cromwell was ceremonially installed as Lord Protector at Westminster Hall, sitting upon King Edward's chair, which was especially moved from Westminster Abbey for the occasion. The event in part echoed a coronation, utilizing many of its symbols and regalia, such as a purple ermine-lined robe, a sword of justice, and a scepter, but no crown and no orb. Of chief concern to Cromwell was the restructuring and reformation of the Church of England. Cromwell maintained that the Reformation in England had never reformed the Church enough, and he sought to purge it of its perceived Catholicism. Under Cromwell, the parliamentary army ransacked English churches, destroying altar rails, altars, stained glass, paintings on screens, the screens themselves, religious statues and carvings, crosses, vestments, prayer books, and organs. Likewise, Cromwell implemented a series of reforms centered on religious observance. On Sundays, the rules were strict. It was considered God's day and had to be devoted entirely to religion. All games and sports were banned. It was even illegal to go for a walk except to attend a religious service in one's own parish. Neither could any housework be done, again for fear of being fined or put in the stocks. The laws were difficult to enforce, so good Puritans were encouraged to spy on their neighbours and denounce any unpuritanical behaviour. They could then claim some of the fine as a reward. Puritan church services were long, and up to 3 hours. All music in churches was banned, including choral and instrumental. The only music permitted by the Puritans was the metrical singing of the psalms. Actors, playwrights, musicians, composers, and singers were all out of work. Artistic expression in England fell silent. John Higginson, the leader of Cromwell's band of musicians, bemoaned the fate of English music in 1656. By reason of the late dissolution of the choirs in the cathedrals, where the study and practice of the science of music was especially cherished, many of its skillful professors, having during the last wars and troubles died in want, and there being now no preferment or encouragement in the way of music, no man will breed his child in it. Oliver Cromwell died in September of 1658, and his son Richard was informed on the same day that he was to succeed him. Richard was faced with two immediate problems. The first was the army, which questioned his position as commander given his lack of military experience. The second was the financial position of the regime, with a debt estimated at £2 million. Richard Cromwell's weak and somewhat reluctant leadership and abysmal handling of state and military affairs set in motion the final split between the civilian-dominated Parliament and the army. This would culminate in the dissolution of Parliament and Richard Cromwell's ultimate fall from power. When Richard refused a demand by the army to dissolve Parliament, troops were assembled at St. James's Palace. Richard eventually gave in to their demands, and Parliament was dissolved. Richard delivered a formal letter resigning the position of Lord Protector. Royalists rejoiced at Richard's fall, and many satirical attacks surfaced in which he was given the unflattering nickname Tumble-Down Dick. During the civil and military unrest which followed, George Monk, the Governor of Scotland, was concerned that the nation would descend into anarchy. Monk and his army marched into the city of London and forced the Parliament to dissolve itself. For the first time in almost 20 years, there was a general election. The election resulted in a House of Commons which was fairly evenly divided on political grounds between the Royalists and Parliamentarians. The new so-called Convention Parliament assembled and soon afterwards received news of the Declaration of Breda, in which Charles agreed, amongst other things, to pardon many of his father's enemies. The English Parliament resolved to proclaim Charles king and invited him to return. Charles arrived in London on his 30th birthday. Although Charles and Parliament granted amnesty to Cromwell's supporters in the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, 50 people were specifically excluded from the protection this document granted. The body of Oliver Cromwell was subjected to the indignity of a posthumous decapitation. The Restoration was accompanied by social change. Puritanism lost its momentum. Theatres reopened after having been closed during the Protectorship, and bawdy Restoration comedy became a recognisable genre. Charles, a patron of the arts and sciences, founded the Royal Observatory and supported the Royal Society, a scientific group whose early members included Robert Hooke, Robert Boyle, and Sir Isaac Newton. Charles was the personal patron of Sir Christopher Wren, the architect who helped rebuild London after the Great Fire. Shortly after the coronation, the Second English Parliament of his reign assembled. Dubbed the Cavalier Parliament, it was overwhelmingly royalist and Anglican, and it sought to discourage nonconformity to the Church of England and passed several acts to secure Anglican dominance. The Act of Uniformity of 1662 made the use of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer compulsory. Specifically, Charles sought to release the Anglican Church and its musicians from the tyranny and suffocation of Cromwell's musical edicts. Charles II had spent much of his exile with his mother in Paris at the expense of the French government and under the good graces of his young cousin Louis XIV. Louis, a talented dancer and an enthusiastic patron of the arts, enticed the finest artists and composers in France to his court. Against the opulent and extravagant backdrop of his glorious palace of Versailles, Louis exposed his English cousin to theatre, ballet, opera, and music. Charles was in awe of this spectacle. Louis demanded a new style of French music that would define his reign and complement the lavishness of his court. And essential for his musical entertainment, Louis appointed composer Jean-Baptiste Lully as his chief master of music. Lully entered the service of the French king as a dancer in the French ballet. Having composed some instrumental music which pleased the king immensely, Lully was commissioned to compose numerous ballets in which the king and Lully himself danced. He was appointed the composer of instrumental music to the king, and placed at the head of the Petit Violon, the king's private orchestra. Soon after, the king appointed Lully the surintendant de la musique de la Chambre du Roi, which brought les 24 violons de roi under Lully's command. Lully's music was known for its power, liveliness, and its fast movements, and its deep emotional character in its sad movements. The influence of Lully's music produced a radical revolution in the style of the dances of the court itself. Instead of the slow and stately movements which had prevailed until then, he introduced lively ballets of rapid rhythm. As he aged and his dancing ability declined, Louis's interest in ballet waned, and Lully pursued opera. He founded the French opera, as he believed Italian-style opera was inappropriate for the French language and people. The king continued to shower Lully with honours, creating a new privilege which essentially gave Lully complete control over all music performed in France. In England, Charles, newly restored to the throne and desperate to legitimize and popularize his reign, was eager to put the misery and bloodshed of the Civil War and the dreariness of the Protectorate behind the English people. Likewise, he sought to restore English society to its pre-Puritan state. Heavily influenced by the time he spent in the French court during his exile, Charles took for his inspiration the example of his cousin Louis. Seeking to emulate Louis's legendary and extravagant forms of entertainment, the English soon developed their own equivalent forms of music and drama, based upon the models of their French counterparts. In the theatres, the comedies of Molière provided the inspiration for the bawdy Restoration comedies. Charles became particularly concerned and personally involved with the music which would define his restoration, and he held the music of Lully in particular as the benchmark. Indeed, evidence exists which suggests Charles made repeated attempts to lure Lully to England. However, failing in his attempts, he was obliged to be content with Robert Cambert, a one-time superintendent of music at the French court, who had been displaced due to Lully's increasing influence and power. Cambert, furious at the insult of being overlooked and at the lack of interest in his work shown by the French monarchy, left France for England. In England, he was warmly received at the court of Charles and was quickly appointed to master of the king's band. Charles had become so enamored with French music that, in his own court, he founded the 24 violins of the king, the English counterpart to Louis's 24 violons du roi. The diarist, Samuel Pepys, made mention of the presence of this new French-styled orchestra as early as 1661, playing at Charles' coronation at Westminster Abbey. The king's 24 violins gradually assumed the burdens of functional music, supplying the dinner music for the king as well as the dance music for the court. Despite his reputation for being a libertine, Charles II regularly attended the Chapel Royal, and he improved its music until its services became, in the words of Pepys, a sight very well worth seeing. The choir of the Chapel Royal was often augmented with the addition of the 24 violins. Charles was adamant that his composers required experience and training in the continental style. Upon the re-establishment of the choir of the Chapel Royal, the talents of one musician in particular caught Charles' attention. At the age of 17, the former choir boy Pelham Humphrey was personally sent to Paris by Charles to study composition under Lully. Charles even funded the enterprise and granted Humphrey £200 to defray the charge of his journey into France. A year later, Humphrey returned to England, almost heroically, and was immediately appointed a gentleman of the Chapel Royal. A short time later, when the position became vacant, he was also appointed Master of the Children of the Chapel Royal. Soon, he and Thomas Purcell, the brother of Henry, were jointly appointed composers in ordinary to the violins of His Majesty. With Humphrey's celebrated return to England and his promotion to the Chapel Royal, Lully's influence over English music was forever cemented, and it would go on to inspire the next generation of English composer.